You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What occurred was that dozens of women showed up. Boylston had been hoarding his coffee. Rather than not selling it because it was now embargoed, he had kept it off the market entirely. And as a result, any coffee that remained, the prices went up, sometimes astronomically. And so as a result, you get to see communities trying to respond to these things by passing legislation to fix prices. And this is an important moment because both sugar and coffee, tea never makes a list, both sugar and coffee repeatedly make the list of these goods that communities have now deemed necessary for life. So Abigail describes these women confronting Boylston, demanding the keys to his warehouse, entering the warehouse, bringing the coffee out, and it's not stolen. They sell it at the regulated price that Boston had set for coffee per pound.
Hello, and welcome to episode 429 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Now, although today, December 16th, marks the anniversary of the Boston Tea Party, we're actually going to embark on a surprising journey about coffee in early America. We'll explore who drank it, why it replaced tea as Americans' beverage, and how it helped shape the new United States. Now, I'm an avid tea drinker. I don't drink coffee at all. But Joseph Edelman, who is an avid coffee drinker, he's going to serve as our host for this episode. It's much better this way because Joe is not only a professor of history at Framingham State University and is a historian of media and politics, he also loves and really enjoys coffee. So with that, I'm going to let Joe introduce our topic and our guest historian.
Thanks, Liz. I'm excited to be back behind the microphone to share another episode, this time about another of my favorite topics, coffee. Now, if you're like me, you probably started your morning with a cup. If you drink it black, more power to you. But I still add a little sugar and milk to mine. And usually I'll drink it at home with breakfast, but you can also sometimes find me in a local coffee shop, meeting up with a friend or catching up on some work. But have you ever thought about where your coffee comes from and how we came to develop the practices that shape our coffee culture? And how did coffee fit into the menu of drinks that colonists and early Americans enjoyed? In this episode, we'll chat with Michelle McDonald, librarian and director of the American Philosophical Society and author of Coffee Nation, How One Commodity Transformed the Early United States. During our conversation, Michelle reveals where coffee grew in vast early America and why North Americans have always imported all of the coffee they drank, how enslaved laborers on Caribbean islands grew and harvested coffee beans for sale in Atlantic trade markets, and how the American Revolution reshaped the relationship that Americans had with their hot beverages. Are you ready to learn more about coffee in vast early America? Once you've brewed a fresh cup, let's go meet our guest historian. Michelle Craig McDonald is the librarian and director of the Librarian Museum at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. Her research focuses on trade and consumer behavior in North America and the Caribbean during the 18th and 19th centuries. Her first book is Coffee Nation, How One Commodity Transformed the United States, which was published by the University of Pennsylvania Press. She's also published numerous academic articles and book chapters. Michelle is also an active public historian, working on a range of projects about the history of Philadelphia and southern New Jersey. Before joining the APS, Michelle taught and was an administrator for many years at Stockton University in New Jersey. Michelle McDonald, welcome to Ben Franklin's World.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with a listener question that I think represents what many people will wonder after hearing about your book on coffee in early America. Lydia asks, I thought everyone drank tea. So can you tell us a little bit about the various hot beverages that people in colonial America drank?
Sure. Let me start with the second half of the question first. What hot beverages did colonial Americans drink? And the answer is there are three primary beverages: tea, coffee, and hot chocolate, all of which arrived in Europe at the 17th century at a time of burgeoning exploration and trade with different parts of the world. There were some other hot beverages, though, as well. What we think of as hot toddies or warmed alcoholic beverages were common in the colonial era. And then there were also a number of herbal infusions. Think goldenrod, which has an anise flavor, or bergamot, which is somewhat lavender in taste, and even fruit-flavored teas like raspberry and strawberry. But I want to speak briefly to the first part of Lydia's comment, where she thought everyone drank tea. In fact, tea was 2 or 3 times as expensive as chocolate, and coffee was the cheapest of all. So many more colonists could afford to drink coffee than they could tea or chocolate.
That's really amazing. We have this image of everyone drinks tea and the Boston Tea Party. I live in New England now where that's a really big deal. So it's fascinating to puncture that myth.
And there's good reasons why. It's a common misconception that North America became a coffee drinking nation because of our animus for tea and the American Revolution. The Boston Tea Party is one of the best loved and most often recounted stories of the American Revolution. But in point of fact, coffee was something that had been consumed for most of the 18th century. So it was not new and it was not post-revolutionary.
Let's go into thinking about how people actually drank coffee and talk about how coffee was served in early America. I'm assuming people had fewer options than they do today at your average Starbucks or Dunkin', that there were no frappuccinos or foam to add or things like that. But did people add milk or cream or sugar or other sweeteners? You started to say already that people added things like goldenrod and bergamot, but are there other flavor enhancers for coffee?
Sure. And I should say the goldenrod and the bergamot weren't added to the coffee. Those were to make other hot beverages like herbal teas. There may not have been Starbucks and Dunkin', and I will add that as a diehard coffee drinker myself, I personally think there should be at least 2 lines in those places, one for people who want coffee and one for people who want what I call coffee-affiliated beverages. Not really coffee. Their primary ingredients are usually something like sugar or milk or some other flavoring.
We'll pass that recommendation along.
I appreciate that. The first colonial coffee houses actually are quite early. The first license I could find of somebody who was retailing coffee was a woman named Dorothea Jones in Boston in 1670. And she called her establishment a tavern. But the first coffee house named a coffee house was opened only 6 years later in 1676, and then in New York by 1696. As for how Americans drank their coffee, they had options. Milk and cream, definitely already part of the 17th century European diet, came over to North America as well. And sugar, which was another Caribbean-based export like coffee, was very common. Those topped the list. But others used spices like cinnamon and cardamom that harken back to Middle Eastern traditional brewing methods. So there were lots of ways to drink coffee.
This is another spot to ask a listener question because Michael wonders if there were any concerns about drinking too much coffee. Were there conversations about people getting the jitters and things like that?
Oh, yes. And that goes back even to the 17th century as well. There were a number of different medical advice tracts that were published through the 17th and into the 18th century about how coffee affected the system. One of the best, not North American granted, but one of the best was a 17th century broadside by women who were adamant that coffee was ruining their marriages. They thought it was a waste of money. They thought it was a waste of their husband's time. They thought it was enfeebling to their manly performance. There's lots of ways in which coffee was denigrated as a not healthy beverage. But then there were other doctors who said coffee was wonderful for all sorts of ailments. It created clarity of mind. It helped with indigestion. And I would say there is early records that demonstrate people's recognition that coffee helped with intoxication.
We'll want to come back to that a little bit later, but we could spend the whole episode talking just about drinking coffee. And you spend quite a bit of time talking about how coffee is produced, how the beans get from the plant to somebody's house for brewing. And I want to make sure we discuss that as well. In Coffee Nation, you explain that coffee did not grow in North America. In fact, it still doesn't grow anywhere in the continental United States. So, Michelle, can you tell us about where and how people cultivated coffee plants in the 17th and 18th centuries?
Sure. Coffee originated in Ethiopia, but its real first boon was through the Ottoman Empire. Mocha became an early port of export that would send coffee to places like Egypt and Syria and Turkey, as well as around the Indian and Asian Oceans. Western Europeans, though, began experimenting with their own imperial sources by the mid-17th century. The Dutch tried coffee growing in Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. The French focused their efforts on the Indian Ocean island of Bourbon, which is off the coast of Madagascar. And I should add that this is the first place that coffee production becomes associated with enslaved labor. But by the early 18th century, there was so much demand that these supplies and these islands were unable to keep up. And there are some debates about which nation first brought it to the Americas. The Dutch claim that they have been growing coffee in Suriname since 1718. French sources argue that they brought it to Martinique and then transplanted it to Saint-Domingue in the same year in 1718. British sources, well, they know they didn't pioneer the commodity. The first coffee trees grown in the English Caribbean weren't planted until 1728. So they usually give credence to the Dutch claims, I think because they just didn't want to give the French the credit.
Fair enough. Can we zoom in on these islands for just a moment? Because as it turns out, coffee's grown on the same islands as sugar, which is obviously the more famous crop from this era. How did planters decide what land goes to which crop?
It's a really good question, and it has everything to do with altitude. Sugar and coffee are very complementary in the sense that sugar tends to be grown in flat areas, low-lying areas, usually coastal areas. Coffee requires elevation. It needs a cooler climate. It needs a wetter climate, and it can be grown in much more difficult vertical climes than sugar ever could. And so the way to think about where coffee is grown in the Caribbean, it's grown anywhere altitude exists. So Jamaica is a great example. Saint-Domingue, which later becomes Haiti, Santo Domingo, which is the Spanish colony, ultimately Cuba. Even in the Eastern Antilles, places like Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent, all have coffee economies. And those are some of the ceded islands that come into the British Empire after the 7 Years' War. Places where coffee doesn't thrive, places like Barbados or Bermuda, places that are really flat, are not suitable for coffee cultivation. But really, you can find coffee throughout the Caribbean by the end of the 18th century. The question isn't where coffee is grown, it's really where coffee isn't. And it's a handful of places that are not suitable.
Did anyone ever try growing it in the upcountry of South Carolina or North Carolina? Because as you're describing more mountainous areas that are wet, there are certainly backcountry regions of the mainland continent where, at least theoretically, it would be possible.
Yeah, actually, one of the earliest examples in the 18th century of an effort to try to encourage coffee cultivation was from South Carolina, but it did not succeed. Jamaica was ultimately the place where Britain, and I think for very good reasons, decided to concentrate their efforts. There is, if we have time near the end of the podcast, a really wonderful 19th century effort to grow coffee in North America, but I'll hold off on that because that's really an 1820 story. But if we have time, I'd love to return to it. But no, coffee was never complementary to North America's climate and topography, so it never succeeded. And there were high hopes because sugar did, of course. Sugar came in and became a wildly profitable export in Louisiana, but coffee requires very, very different growing conditions. If I could return to 1 second, you did ask me not just where coffee and sugar were grown, but why someone would invest in one and not the other. The capital requirements that you needed to start a coffee plantation were much, much lower than they were for sugar. It needed less land. It needed fewer enslaved people to begin a holding. It was less profitable, of course, at that level, but it was accessible in a way that sugar planting really wasn't, except for those who had significant means at the top of the planter class.
Let's shift and talk about the enslaved laborers who were doing the work on these coffee farms and plantations. For each of the crops that people might be familiar with from the era of Atlantic slavery, whether that's sugar or tobacco or rice or something else, there was a complicated process for getting them from identifying land for planting to the point where one could harvest a crop. Can you talk about how enslaved laborers grew coffee on these island hillsides and more broadly about the labor regime that these enslaved people worked and lived under?
I'll start by saying that slavery was absolutely critical to the rise of coffee production. Indeed, in some islands in the Eastern Antilles, coffee farms well outnumbered sugar plantations. So while the farms might be smaller, there were many more of them. And so the aggregate number of enslaved people was significant. They were involved in all aspects of coffee production, from clearing the land. That was the first step. I mentioned that these were high altitude regions. That doesn't mean that they were barren. They were forested regions. And so the first step would be to clear those forests, to clear the trees, and then to set out planting beds. And there were a number of ways in which you could do this. If it was a larger plantation, you would really try to remove the stumps and everything. If it was a smaller plantation, you had to still remove the forest, or the trees wouldn't get the sunlight and the rain that they needed. But you could remove a subsection and then plant in between the stumps that remained. Most coffee farmers tried, if they could, to plant with seedlings as opposed to seeds, because it meant that they could move into years of production more quickly. But that planting, the subsequent weeding, which was all done on, these are not flat terrain. This is very high and rocky landscapes on which enslaved people are working. All of the planting, all of the weeding, pruning of coffee plants to make sure they didn't grow too tall to keep them within arm's height, and then the actual picking itself. And then after the picking, there's still multiple steps to go. Coffee, it arrives in a coffee cherry, a round berry, which usually held 2 beans. And you had to first run it through millers to get that outer shell off, and then run it through a second set of millers to get what's called parchment, or a sticky membrane that's on the beans off, and then lie it out. That's green coffee, lie it out to dry before packing it for shipment. Most coffee was shipped green and then roasted on site when people purchased it. But all of those steps, from clearing, planting, pruning, weeding, picking, processing, packing, and ultimately even taking it to harbor for shipment, all of that was done by enslaved labor.
That's a wide variety of tasks requiring many different skill sets. Michelle, do we know anything about the demographics of the enslaved laborers who worked on these plantations? Were enslavers looking for particular characteristics in the enslaved people they acquired?
Sure. And I should say that there's some wonderful extant manuals by coffee planters, and then advertisements for those who are selling enslaved people that help to provide some of this information, as well as extant letter books through the Caribbean that demonstrate what the demographics look like. So in the initial stages of a coffee farm's creation, most coffee farmers were looking for male enslaved people where they could, because this was extremely hard, backbreaking work, taking an untamed forest and making it manageable as a commercial enterprise. But interestingly, what comes up repeatedly in letters and manuals is that after a farm is established, coffee farmers tended to hire more female enslaved workers. And that was because the women were considered to be more dexterous with their hands, more likely to pick cherries carefully as opposed to pulling on branches. This was a very delicate, hard work that needed attention to detail. And over again, women were assigned to this work because the result was coffee cherries picked without harm to the plants for future growth. So you see this laying out in account books, in ledger books that survive from coffee plantations, and enumerate who the enslaved people were and what their assigned work would be. Men were still reserved for things like, for the most part, coffee processing, operating the millworks, and certainly taking coffee that had been packed for export down to a harbor or port.
And how does that compare to the gender ratios that someone would see on a sugar plantation or a tobacco plantation, some of these other crops that we're familiar with?
Really good question again. Sugar, increasingly, there has been a real interest in the role of enslaved women on sugar plantations. And even though sugar is generally seen as being more physically taxing, the mortality rates were higher on sugar plantations than they were on coffee farms by and large. But many more women were actually engaged in sugar field work than I think had initially been given credit by sugar's early historians. So men that were increasingly important, there was many more skilled positions in terms of sugar production than there was in coffee production. So for sugar, once sugarcane is cut, you have started a clock, and that clock requires that the sugar be processed very quickly or it will ferment. And so that requires round the clock firing of mills and boiling of sugar. And that work was really, in fact, almost entirely to skilled male enslaved workers. So you do still see a higher percentage of men working in these capacities on sugar plantations than coffee plantations. But both forms of commodity agriculture incorporated a significant number of women as well.
So, Michelle, we've got dried but still green, unroasted coffee beans that are loaded onto a ship in Jamaica or Cuba or Saint Domingue or some other island in the Caribbean, and the coffee is then transported to North America. Once it gets to a colonial port, merchants then had to sell it to consumers, either to drink in public at a coffee house or to roast and brew at home. What was the market like, and what was the marketing like for coffee in the mainland colonies in this era?
It really depends on when you're talking about. So I'm going to start with the pre-revolutionary era, and then I know we can talk a bit later about what happens after the war ends. During the pre-revolutionary era, you just mentioned a number of places coffee could come from. Jamaica, Saint-Domingue. But most of the coffee that came into North America came from the British Caribbean, Jamaica, Dominica, Grenada, St. Vincent. And so, because there was a dominant single supplier for most North American coffee drinkers, you don't see it advertised as you would something like Madeira wine or Irish linen, where the location really meant something to prospective buyers because it signaled something about quality. Instead, coffee usually just shows up in advertisements as coffee, one of any number of dozens of commodities that any shopkeeper might advertise for sale. If, however, I will say there are exceptions, if a vendor got a hold of coffee that did come from the French Caribbean, either through privateering or through salvage or, honestly, through smuggling, or from the East Indies, because there is still some East Indian coffee that is coming into North America, much smaller, much more expensive, then they would emphasize the region of origin because that was considered a stock that could fetch a higher price. And I do have more to say about smuggling, but most marketing pre-revolutionary, coffee is really just coffee. An advertiser isn't going to waste words on describing a product that has, for the most part, one provider.
Which is very different from today, where I go to the grocery store and even the store brands tout the origins of the beans and the quality of the roast. And that's before getting to the micro roasteries and the national chains. So it's interesting how recent a development that is in terms of marketing coffee as a differentiated product.
Mm-hmm. And that does change a bit. And again, in the post-revolutionary period, when the number of our suppliers begins to grow, then you do see more attention to, if not in the retail market, certainly in the wholesale market, you see differentiations between where the coffee is coming from.
One thing that fascinated me in reading Coffee Nation is that you talk about the development of essentially coffee connoisseurs, that people were coming up with all sorts of tools to prepare coffee in increasingly specialized and elaborate ways. What were some of the different methods that people used to prepare their coffee?
It could go from the very basic to the very complicated. In terms of roasting, you could, and many people did, simply roast coffee in a pan over a fire. That's the easiest way to do it. But as early as the beginning of the 18th century, and certainly by the mid-18th century, I have a wonderful description in a diary by Landon Carter, who lived in Virginia and kept this remarkable series of diaries from 1752 to 1778. He describes a spit roaster, which was adapted from a Dutch model, which was a cylinder with a crank handle that basically you put the beans inside the cylinder. It's on two sets of feet that would be over a fire. And then the hand crank would keep the beans roasting or moving at a constant rate over the fire until it had reached the optimum color and roasted flavor. And you see these beginning to appear on a regular basis as well. You could also take your coffee to a coffee house for roasting. You didn't necessarily have to do it yourself. So if you were buying for personal purchase, you could take it to a coffee house and have it roasted for you. And there are some distinctions in terms of, even by the 18th century, some distinctions in terms of lighter roast or darker roast, and even some national distinctions between North American coffee and, say, French coffee, which tended to be darker and heavier, more acidic. But for the most part, you have a variety of options for roasting. Where you really see the explosion of paraphernalia is in coffee brewing and serving. Those are areas of a lot of differentiation.
Can you tell us more about that, Michelle? How did the different types of equipment help shape coffee culture? And in particular, I was hoping you could start at the higher end, because there's a great image you share in the book of a Paul Revere silver coffee service.
So at the very high end, you have sterling silver, right? And that describes the Paul Revere set that I show in the book, which is a masterpiece. It has a huge coffee pot. It does also have an accompanying teapot. It has a sugar bowl. It has a creamer. It has other various accoutrements. What's important to think about with a coffee pot versus a teapot, and I'm using my hands to gesture. So for those of you on the podcast, you're not seeing this, but imagine, if you will, that the coffee pot is at least twice the height of a teapot. And that's because, for the most part, these coffee pots are used for serving, not actually brewing. There's other more basic coffee pots that are actually used to brew the coffee itself, and then it's poured into the silver teapot for presentation. But these required a tremendous amount of metal. If you look at Revere's records, he actually calculates how many ounces of silver for the coffee pot and how many ounces of silver for the teapot. And it's nearly double for the coffee pot what is necessary for the teapot, making this a really expensive statement piece that someone like this would be able to order and then have in their home. If you went further down the line, though, if you couldn't afford sterling silver, you might be able to afford a silver plate, which was increasingly popular in the 18th century. And there were even some methods like Sheffield plating, which were making it very difficult to distinguish between sterling and plate. Sheffield bonded the metal together and would allow plating on the inside of a vessel in addition to the outside of the vessel. So you could pick up the pot, you could look at the underside, you could look inside, and you wouldn't be able to see a distinction in the metalware. So that was a really great option if you wanted the look of luxury, but didn't necessarily have the capacity to buy what Revere was making. And then further down the line, and these show up everywhere. They show up in probate inventories. They show up in correspondence. A profusion of them show up in newspaper advertisements and shop notices. Coffee pots in Chinese export porcelain, in ceramic, in stoneware, and creamware, which could be really decorated. It wasn't just cream colored. It wasn't just basic. It could be tortoiseshell. It could be in fanciful fruit and vegetables. Cauliflower ware was very popular for a while. But it could also be in painted tin. And what I take when I look at all of these together is that there were options for displaying personal taste and a sense of style available to all ranks of coffee drinkers, not just those at the top of the sterling silver pyramid.
We'll include a link in the show notes to the Paul Revere collection at the Worcester Art Museum so that people can visualize the pieces. One additional question that occurs to me is how the vessel affects the taste and whether people talk about that. There's a difference between brewing and serving in silver and serving it in stoneware or some other material. Do people talk about that? Do they notice it?
They do. First of all, you would never brew in silver. Never brew it in silver, only serve it in silver. You would not want to damage the silver or even the silver plate, or even the ceramic vessels really weren't used for brewing. These would be more utilitarian copper or tin vessels that were actually used to brew and then decanted into their various serviceware for pouring. The metalwares, silver and silver plate, for reasons that should be obvious, retain heat much better than ceramic vessels do. And so there are distinctions in terms of, think of it as they're not as good, of course, as a modern day carafe, but coffee is going to remain at an optimal heat temperature longer if it's kept in a metal vessel than if it's kept in a ceramic vessel. Many of the ceramic vessels, a lot of them were for home use, but these were more ubiquitous in places like taverns and inns and coffee houses, which serve coffee, because the coffee is poured more quickly, it's served more quickly, it's replenished more quickly. And so retaining that heat throughout a dinner party is not going to be the same issue as you would have, say, in a private home. Do we have a second to talk about coffee cups?
Yes, please, of course.
There's some wonderful evidence about the proliferation of all kinds of coffee paraphernalia, coffee pots, coffee spoons, coffee cups, coffee saucers, which came again in all shapes and sizes, not metalware, obviously, for the cups and saucers, but creamware, stoneware, Chinese export porcelain, with handles, without handles. All of these are options, but you can see, first of all, in just the range of materials available, how popular this drink was becoming. But you can also begin to see the ways in which etiquette was forming around its consumption. I found a great series of letters from a woman named Mary Shippen when she was visiting her relatives in Lancaster in 1772. And she describes how the visit's going well. It's a wonderful farm. The family have been welcoming. But she also writes to her husband about something that she considered a social gaffe, which is that when her relative puts out coffee cups for afternoon service, and she doesn't have enough coffee cups because she has more people in her home than she has in her service, she substitutes teacups for some people. And for Mary, this was a bit shocking, but it reminded her that some of her own coffee cups back in Philadelphia were chipped or broken. And at that point, she asked Joseph to please purchase more so that she wouldn't have to face the same conundrum. And what that tells me two things. It tells me for people like Mary, the proper way to serve coffee was becoming something that was socially prescribed. But it also tells me that for others, like her Lancaster family, that etiquette was less relevant. Some people simply made do with what they had available. But you see these different social distinctions beginning to emerge even before the American Revolution, which I thought was interesting.
You talked a little bit about coffee houses just now, which we haven't discussed fully yet, but is another side of the culture of coffee. Can you talk about how coffee houses and other public spaces fit into and shape drinking coffee, the social world around coffee, and other activities?
Coffee houses, and one of the questions I get a lot are, how are coffee houses similar or different than, say, inns or taverns? All of these are public houses, and inns and taverns have been around since the colonies really began forming communities. Coffee houses, named as coffee houses, began emerging before the beginning of the 18th century. All of them had some things in common. All of them served food and beverage, and I want to be very clear, coffee houses served much more than coffee. I could find the record of one coffee house that didn't apply for a liquor license in Philadelphia, and it closed in less than a year. So let's be clear. It's not like a modern day coffee house where you're going in to get variations of coffee. You were going in to get food and drink of a variety of kinds. These places also tended to provide accommodation. They could provide stabling. All of these they had in common. But I would say the biggest distinction between taverns and inns and coffee houses is that taverns and inns tended to support people visiting or traveling through a community, whereas coffee houses really were primarily places for a community's residents. They served not just as places for entertainment or for consumption or for accommodation. They served as banks because there wasn't a private banking system at this point. They served as places of currency exchange and would post on a regular basis what the value of currency was in different parts of the world where merchants in that community were doing business. They served as media outlets. Many coffee houses subscribed to a range of newspapers. In fact, they would list those newspapers when they were advertising for business because it demonstrated how patrons would be able to connect to news around the world while they were conducting their business affairs. They served as economic clearing houses. They would post notices of ships arriving and leaving and what they were bringing into port and what they were shipping out of port. And they served as auction houses, not only for local goods, but often for imported goods or privateer cargo or confiscated goods. There is a great letter written by a Philadelphian named Edward Shippen to his nephew when he first moved to Philadelphia, urging him to consider where he spent his time. Taverns, he said, were places of frivolous activity. To be taken seriously, business needed to be done at the coffee house. And that's what these were. These were places of business transaction, which is why it's no wonder that when parliamentary acts began to affect colonial business affairs, right, and finances and trade policy, coffee houses were often the places where they gathered to discuss their reactions.
That's a great segue, Michelle, to talking about coffee and the American Revolution. Let's pick up the conversation there right after we thank our episode sponsors.
You know, every time I sit down with a guest historian, I'm reminded of something. Good history takes time, care, and resources. The research behind each interview, the careful myth-busting, the effort to bring you trustworthy stories about the people who shaped early America, that all matters. And it's all supported by listeners like you. Right now, we're in the middle of our end-of-year fundraising campaign, which began on Giving Tuesday, and something really special is happening. A generous fan of Ben Franklin's World has stepped forward to match every donation twice, up to $3,700. And as of today, we're 77% of the way to that goal, which means that your gift, whether it's a one-time, monthly, or annual donation, will go 3 times as far in supporting the show. So if Ben Franklin's World has ever helped you see the past more clearly or brought a moment of curiosity into your day, I hope you'll consider supporting the show right now, and your dollars will be tripled. Your gift directly supports the production of this podcast, so all the research, audio editing, hosting, and all the work that goes into creating the in-depth, trustworthy conversations that you can rely on. So please help support Ben Franklin's World. You can do it at benfranklinsworld.com/donate. That's benfranklinsworld.com/donate. And to those who have already contributed, thank you. Thank you so much. Listeners like Andrew M., Dominic M., Nadine P., Robin P., and Amanda R., you help support this work. You help make this work possible. And I'm so deeply grateful. Thank you. Thank you for your support. And thank you, my friend, for listening, for your generosity, and for being a part of this amazing community of people who know that history matters.
Michelle, we started our conversation by talking about the comparison between coffee and tea and the misconception that tea was the more important beverage around the era of the American Revolution. Can you tell us, politically speaking, how did coffee figure into the revolutionary protests of the 1760s and 1770s?
I will throw a bone to those who think that the American Revolution is related to coffee drinking and say that for a few months, coffee could actually serve as that patriotic proxy. When the first non-importation agreements were passed, they focused on British exports from Britain. And there is a great letter from 1774 of an English visitor to Alexandria who is witnessing the election of town burgesses. And he records in his diary, "In the evening, the returned member, who was George Washington at the time, gave a ball to the freeholders and gentlemen of the town. This was conducted with great harmony, coffee and chocolate, but no tea, which has fallen into disgrace among those here." Even the Boston Tea Party has a coffee moment. Allegedly, there was a school teacher who was involved in the event and came home and took his tea canister down and wrote coffee on one side and no tea on the other. But the real challenge is that in 1774, later in 1774, North Americans added all British imperial products, so including the British Caribbean commodities, to the embargo of British goods. And this effectively ended coffee's ability to serve as any kind of icon for insurgents, because coffee was now something we were no longer supposed to be importing as part of the British imperial market.
You have a really fascinating quotation from John Adams in a letter that he writes to Abigail, his wife, that he wants her and other Bostonians to stop drinking coffee in the middle of the war in 1777. What made coffee consumption so controversial at that moment in the war?
So he was reacting to two things in that letter. Number one, again, if the British Caribbean is going to be part of our embargo, then everything coming in from the British Caribbean needed to be embargoed as well, and that included coffee. Again, other sources, any other potential sources of coffee, and you do have shopkeepers that sometimes are at pains to demonstrate that the coffee they have came in from a privateering ship and was of French origin, so could be legally sold. There were ways around that loophole. Abigail herself actually talks about salvage efforts where ships are wrecked and the goods that can come off. They're very careful to say those then can be sold. So there are some goods that are available. But John was writing to Abigail at a particular moment. The letter he was responding to that had come from her had been describing a coffee riot in Boston that had taken place at the warehouse of a merchant named Thomas Boylston. And what occurred was that dozens of women showed up. Boylston had been hoarding his coffee. Rather than not selling it because it was now embargoed, he had kept it off the market entirely. And as a result, any coffee that remained, the prices went up, sometimes astronomically, as did all West Indian goods during this period. And so as a result, you get to see communities trying to respond to these things by passing legislation to fix prices. And this is an important moment because both sugar and coffee, tea never makes a list, both sugar and coffee repeatedly make the list of these goods that communities have now deemed necessary for life. So Abigail describes these women confronting Boylston, demanding the keys to his warehouse, entering the warehouse, bringing the coffee out, and it's not stolen. They sell it at the regulated price that Boston had set for coffee per pound. But John has a very different reaction. His response is best to leave off all West India goods. In fact, he specifically says we must bring ourselves to live upon the produce of our own country. So he's taken a very different stance than Abigail has. Abigail doesn't give up. She continues to grumble about shortages, including coffee shortages, in several letters after. But John is looking at this from a political gaze. Abigail is looking at this as really affecting her home, her life, and her social experiences.
And this is a moment where John Adams is already in Europe as a diplomat for the new United States, so he's not worried about not being able to get access to coffee.
Right, fair enough. Yeah, they're facing different shortage issues, exactly. But it is this interesting moment where you see coffee being politicized in this way. But the number of places, number of colonies that try this price fixing method, even the Continental Congress actually tries price fixing for a range of like 26 goods. And some of them are things you would expect like potatoes and pork. But the fact that coffee has made this list really tells you how many people were drinking it and assumed this was not, again, a rarefied experience for the few. This had become the domestic habit of the many.
In episode 161, Liz talked with several scholars of trade in the Atlantic world about the significant role that smuggling played during the Revolutionary War. And as you've discussed in Coffee Nation, coffee was also a product that was smuggled into North American ports throughout both the colonial and the revolutionary periods. Michelle, do you have any sense of what proportion came into ports that way? How do smuggling and illicit trade play a role, specifically in trading coffee?
If I could quantify how much coffee was coming in illegally, I would be a really, really popular historian indeed, because, of course, privateering and smuggling are really hard to track numerically because they're not supposed to be tracked. That being said, there's some wonderful examples that demonstrate how coffee moves in this illicit way. And the one I'm going to use is 1773, which is slightly earlier, but it's a great example that I think hints at the scale of this illicit activity. So this particular case was a captain named John Ash, who was sailing on behalf of a Liverpool-based firm. And he was attempting to go to Puerto Rico to trade for different kinds of cargo. It wasn't coffee initially, mules, and I think some sugar, for example, but he wasn't able to find any. But he did find a prodigious amount of coffee, and he thought that this would be a good substitute. So he works with Puerto Ricans off the coast, and it's very clear in his correspondence they're doing this in out bays. And then the Puerto Ricans had suggested this. They're part of the Spanish Empire. They're not supposed to be trading directly at this point with the British Empire. So they tell him where to go, and they meet him, and they bring the coffee out to his ship. So then Captain Ash goes to Jamaica. And if he had simply kept his mouth shut, he probably would have been fine. But instead, he tells many people that he's got coffee in his cargo hold that he wants to resell either in Jamaica below current prices, or he would take it for North America for the North American market. The customs officials don't take too kindly. They break into his ship, and there's a junior customs agent who clearly has a flair for the dramatic, because he recounts it by dark of night and lantern light. They approach the vessel, and initially they could only find a few bags of coffee that were listed in the cargo manifest. But upon a closer examination of the vessel, they found that the bunks of senior officers had been packed with coffee, that the sides of the ship had removable doors that could be used to stash coffee inside or any other kind of illicit goods inside. The fact that you have a vessel that is specifically designed for illicit activity really does give you a sense. This was not a one-off opportunity. This was a vessel that was constructed for contraband. And that, I thought, was one of the most interesting cases of coffee smuggling that I came across.
After the Revolutionary War, you described the economy of the new United States turning into a Creole economy when it came to coffee, as people sought out new markets, expanded, and changed the way that coffee was marketed and sold. Michelle, can you tell us what that term, Creole economy, means and how it helps us understand the market for coffee in the 1780s and 1790s?
In this instance, I was taking a term, Creole, that's usually applied to things like language or cultural practices, and the combination of different influences that meld and create something that is situationally specific. And I wanted to look at that. It had been applied to internal economies, but I wanted to look at it from a regional perspective. So after the American Revolution, several things happened. Number one, the United States is no longer able to freely trade with the British Empire. So they have to look for other sources because they're now treated as a foreign nation when allowed to trade at all. So they began looking for French sources, for Spanish sources, for Dutch sources, even Danish. Although the Danish colonies aren't producing coffee, they can serve as neutral transshipment points. And that is one of the things that occurs. They have some luck initially in Cuba, but Spain shuts that down fairly quickly. They have more luck in French ports, in particular with Saint-Domingue, at least in the 1780s. Before the Haitian Revolution, it becomes much more complicated during the conflict, although coffee trading does continue during several years of the conflict. And for the Dutch, again, for the most part, you're looking at transshipment rather than directly importing Dutch-produced coffee. But one of the reasons why I gravitated toward this term, Creole economy, is that we're used to thinking the end of the Revolutionary War as being this watershed event where North America becomes independent and then focuses on national politics, national economies, national developments, these revolutions in the market, in transportation, in communication, in immigration. And what I really wanted to show was that in one of the industries, which really becomes one of the fastest growing industries in terms of economic significance by the end of the 18th century, and most emphatically in the first quarter of the 19th century, did not depend on independence. It required on growing dependence. Rather than one supplier, we were now trying to negotiate and gain entry to the suppliers of a variety of different empires. And this really becomes, in other words, the United States becomes more involved in Caribbean economic activities rather than less involved.
Let's zoom in on the Caribbean politics, because there's also a revolution in what was the French colony of Saint-Domingue that began in 1791 and continued until 1804, when the formerly enslaved people there declared themselves to be the independent nation of Haiti. How did coffee figure into the Haitian Revolution, Michelle? And how did it figure into the reactions of the United States to events on the island?
Saint-Domingue was the world's leading producer of coffee by the end of the 18th century. It was also a leading global producer of sugar as well. More than 50% of both commodities, maybe up to 60% for coffee, was being grown in this one fantastically wealthy Caribbean colony. And I should say again, I mentioned that coffee trading continued during portions of the Haitian Revolution. The initial violence of the revolution targeted sugar plantations and portions of the colony that focused on sugar planting. And so for a while, coffee could still be shipped out of the colony. And I have an extended story of a Philadelphia-based merchant firm, Dutillon Walksmith, that maintained a pilot office as long as they could in Saint-Domingue for just this reason, to help ferry coffee back and forth. Well, not back and forth, really just from Saint-Domingue to North America. But interestingly, it was less the destruction to the coffee works that ended the viability of a North American Saint-Domingue connection. It was the end of the Haitian Revolution, the declaration of Haiti as a free Black nation, and the ultimate decision of the United States to embargo that nation, as did pretty much all nations of Western Europe, that ended that commercial possibility. So the Haitian Revolution did two things. It cut off access to what had been the global producer of coffee, and it set North Americans on other trajectories to try to fill what was also a global gap then in the coffee market, because it wasn't just the United States that wasn't getting that coffee. Really, almost no one was importing coffee from Saint-Domingue as a way of penalizing that nation for seeking its independence. Cuba filled the gap for a while. Jamaica filled the gap for a while. But really, this is the moment when there is a significant turn in Brazil, in what is then still Portuguese Brazil, in coffee planting. And by 1820, certainly by 1830, Brazil has emerged as the global leader. It remains one of the global leaders of coffee worldwide, but it becomes the global leader of coffee production and the global supplier of coffee, the leading coffee supplier to North America, and at a volume just completely unheard of in the 18th century. This is the beginning of what becomes the modern coffee economy. And the United States is a major player in that dynamic. But again, only because it relies on Brazil's supplies. We cannot produce coffee for ourselves.
So the United States has never successfully grown coffee on the North American mainland. But people did try. Earlier in our conversation, you previewed for us just such a story from the early 19th century, where people were directly interested in reducing the dependence on imported coffee, as you've been describing. Can you tell us about that experiment? And more importantly, why it failed?
Absolutely. This is the story of the East Florida Coffee Land Association, which was started by a Saint-Domingue immigrant who left during the Haitian Revolution and came to Philadelphia. And he writes a number of pamphlets on different subjects, on language, on music, on math and banking, but his best known was about coffee production. So during his flight from Saint-Domingue, his ship was blown off course, landed temporarily in Florida, and then he continues to Philadelphia. And he starts by trying to get a subscription of different people who might invest in this project. He claims, and he couches all of this, I should say, really in a very overt language of nationalism. These are all patriotic Americans who want to lessen our dependence on foreign production, who recognize an opportunity, who would become the first line of defense against smugglers from the South. There's even some military overtones that these communities could help to guard against smuggling or even forestall runaway enslaved people who are trying to head south. There's all of these ways in which this would be a grand project. And so he applies to Congress in 1821 for a huge number of acres near modern-day Key Largo for coffee planting. And there's effort to invest. He does a trip south with several of his investors to go check out the property. You can follow their trip south. It appears in newspaper reports. And he arrives, and by that time, they have rebranded themselves as the United States Coffee Land Association. And they come back and they're energized by the sun and by the humidity. And yeah, the real challenge, of course, is that he had everything in this book from longitude to latitude about where it grows in the West Indies and compared it to the sugar and its transplantation to North America, completely overlooking altitude. Think about this. Coffee grows best at 2,000 feet above sea level, even better, actually, at 4,000 feet above sea level. What is the average above sea level in Key Largo?
I think the highest point in the entire state of Florida is about 300 feet.
Exactly. There are many places in Key Largo below sea level. It was never going to grow as a cash crop. But the reason I love this story, it goes all the way through Congress. There's actual debates about whether or not to support this initiative. That's how important coffee had become, trying to find a domestic source. We don't, of course, have a domestic source until we change what the parameters of the United States are by annexing Hawaii and Puerto Rico. And then you do see in advertising U.S. coffee from its own provinces, right? Touting their affiliation with the nation as a selling point to consumers. This is not foreign. This is homegrown in Hawaii or Puerto Rico.
Staying in the early 19th century, you talk in the final chapter of Coffee Nation about a variety of contexts for coffee, including as a cure for drunkenness, debates about whether kids should have caffeine, and even whether you can make coffee with something other than coffee beans. So, Michelle, how did coffee culture develop and change in the early decades of the 19th century?
My sources for those tended to focus more on the first North American cookbooks. So the first North American cookbook shows up in the late 18th century, but these are all post-revolutionary cookbooks. What I was trying to find out was when and how does coffee show up as something that's going to be regularly touted as part of the American diet? And you can see some early affiliations like coffee and chicory, for example, show up early on. You can also see there's widely different variations of ratios of water to coffee beans, depending on if you want your coffee stronger or if you want your coffee weaker. If you're drinking coffee in the morning versus what the brewing should be in the afternoon. And there are also those who are not fans of coffee because they think that it creates a dependence. They recognize what we see now as an addiction, right? People who get headaches or become nervous or jittery if they can't have coffee. That being said, you then see coffee recipes for children, as you mentioned, or even for the elderly as a regular part of these recipes for general consumption. So what I take from that is coffee isn't going away. What you're seeing is an effort to modify it based on different audiences. That demonstrates a re-entrenchment of coffee in North Americans' diet rather than the opposite. And I think it tells us about how pervasive coffee drinking has become by the 19th century.
As a coffee drinker, I struggled with the idea that you could soak oats in water and call it coffee. What were some examples of what people were brewing to make something that they called coffee? And have you ever tried it?
No, I have not. I would be interested in trying it. But no, they would try burned wheat. They would try rye. And these are not very good recipes. Even most readers acknowledge that they don't really taste like coffee. They're a substitute if you can't get coffee itself. But there was a great tract that was published about the health habits of the poor. And even that acknowledges that coffee and tea are broadly consumed by people of very meager means. And so they could try to stretch it by adulterating it with some of these other things, but they really weren't the same. But I think the goal really was, for some, it was to try to create a substitute for coffee. And some writers who were very clear that they recognize this as foreign dependence. They couch it in languages of foreign dependence. But I think many more recognize that coffee is here to stay. And if anything, they can try to at least reduce the amount of caffeine or change the balance of water to coffee or change the balance of milk to coffee so that it doesn't have quite the same caffeine effect, create the same caffeine dependence that we're used to associating with coffee today.
It's time for the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. And we're going to head back to the Revolutionary War for this. Michelle, if the British Parliament had passed a law about importing and taxing coffee instead of tea in the 1770s, would the Sons of Liberty and other patriots have been able to generate a similar level of protest about the drink?
Okay, let me start by saying something that most people don't know, which is in the same session of Parliament that decided to repeal most of the Townshend duties but keep the tax on tea, they also voted to continue the rebate on taxing coffee so long as it was sold within the British Empire. So just hold on to that for just a moment. They were trying again, I think for different reasons. Again, the tea is coming in through a monopoly at this point, through the East India Tea Company, which is an East Indian company, but the sources of production are not British. British coffee is produced by British coffee planters. And so they are protecting what they see as an imperial internal industry rather than protecting a company that was bringing in what is largely a foreign product. That being said, think back to that coffee riot that I described in Boston. It was not the only one. There were other riots, many that brought different West Indian goods together, but coffee figured in a fair number of them. So if that many people could get agitated to publicly protest access to coffee, do I think that if British Parliament had begun taxing coffee, that there wouldn't have been a revolutionary response? I think there would have been, for two reasons. Number one, we've already seen it in action on a smaller scale. And number two, there were so many more coffee drinkers that were affected, that would be affected if coffee became more expensive than would have been affected by tea. For tea, it is still relatively an elite commodity. Coffee was not. Coffee was everywhere.
Over the years, we've talked with several scholars of tea on Ben Franklin's World, and you're reframing that debate to make it sound surprising that protesting tea worked based on who was drinking it.
Well, I'll say two things. Number one, the protest about tea was about tea and wasn't about tea. It was really about parliamentary control and the ability to tax. And so I think people were reacting, even non-tea drinkers, not because of their love for the beverage specifically, but about what it said about their political standing within the empire. Yeah, I think that's the best way to frame it.
Thank you, Michelle. You obviously just finished a book and you have a busy job, but before we conclude, would you tell us what aspect of history you're researching and writing about now?
Sure. I'm hoping this has been a project. All historians have them. We have projects that you run across at some point in your career and you think that would be a really great project or a great article or a great book, but you don't have time for it now. This one I have been living with for more than 2 decades, and I'll be giving a paper on it at a conference next February, so I have to do more on it now. This is a project about the 6 women who signed Philadelphia's 1765 non-importation agreement. So this is an agreement that's signed by hundreds of people, but among the signatures are those of 6 women. One of them, Magdalene Devine, I have been interested in for quite some time. She immigrated with her family from Ireland. She was a linen merchant. You can track her in the advertisements, and also her will exists at the Hagley Museum. So I have a little bit more detail about her, but my goal is to try to flesh out to the extent possible who were the 6 women who participated in Philadelphia's first real stance against British legislative changes and what motivated them to do so.
That sounds like a great topic, and we'll look forward to hearing more from you about what you come up with. Michelle, where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how people can get in contact with you?
Okay. I do have a website. So you can go to, all one word, MichelleCraigMcDonald.com, and that will take you to a website that has all of the information about publications, upcoming events, my background, not only in academia, but in public history, which was a huge part of my life, and a way to contact me. There's a contact page. So I encourage anyone who's interested in doing so to reach out. I always enjoy hearing from people and learning more about what their questions are about my work.
Michelle, thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation. I probably need to go get another cup of coffee myself now after chatting with you.
I will join you.
Thank you so much for joining us to talk about coffee in early America.
And thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Colonial Americans drank a lot of coffee. And in the early United States, drinking coffee became a key marker of American identity. Yet, as Michelle McDonald explains to us, the inexpensive hot beverage, by definition, has always been imported because coffee has never grown on the mainland of North America. Coffee required significant amounts of enslaved labor to grow, harvest, and prepare for shipment. For landowners on islands such as Jamaica, it meant they could devote more land to profitable crops. They planted sugar in the swampy lowlands and coffee in the more mountainous regions. In the British North American colonies, coffee served a social purpose as people gathered to drink it, bought utensils to serve it, and came up with new ways to enhance the drink. We may not always realize it, but drinking coffee with a little sugar connects us, therefore, directly back to the world of vast early America. You can find information about Michelle, her book, Coffee Nation, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/429. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this episode of the podcast comes from Liz Covart and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, do you have a question about early America? Feel free to send it along to us at joe@benfranklinsworld.com.